Rain had been moving up the troublesome Creek Valley since before daylight, and by the time Corporal Marcus Dean turned his county emergency services truck up the Ridge Road above Hazard, Kentucky, the temperature had dropped into the low 40s and the creek below was already running brown and fast. In the passenger seat, Pepper lifted her nose from the seat cushion and pointed it at the Ridge House on the left. Then she made the sound she made when something in the ground beneath a building was not right, a low, winding note, not a bark. The particular vocalization of a nose that has found something it does not want to have found. Marcus had heard it twice before. Both times he had listened. Through the windshield, a small white house sat on the ridge crest with a fresh coat of paint on the siding and a porch light on at 9 in the morning, and a figure visible through the front window. Moving in the kitchen in the way of someone who had been moving in that kitchen for a very long time and expected to keep doing so. What Pepper found beneath that floor would reveal that the woman standing on it had been trusting the wrong man for 14 months, and that the truth of it had been sitting directly under her feet. This channel tells one story at a time. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Marcus Dean was 34 years old and had been paying attention to buildings that were trying to tell him something since before he was old enough to be doing the work legally. He had lied about his age, to enlist at 17, spent one Gulf War tour learning that structures under pressure communicated in a specific language, the creak of a load-bearing wall, the particular silence before a ceiling gave way, and come home at 19 with a service ribbon, a permanent ringing in his right ear from a mortar strike outside Kuwait City, and an instinct for structural failure that he had been unable to turn off in the 15 years since. He had done 2 more tours in Iraq in his 20s, both of them longer than the first one, and harder in the ways that the longer ones are always harder, and had come back from the last one to Hazard, Kentucky, because Hazard was the place his people were, and because the county emergency services work was the kind of work that used everything he knew without asking him to explain any of it. He drove flood zones, wildfire corridors, compromised roads after heavy weather. He assessed damage, coordinated repairs, flagged structural hazards before they became disasters. He was good at it in the specific way of people who have learned a skill through consequences rather than curriculum. The thing he carried from the Gulf, not loudly, but behind everything else, was a woman's face, an Iraqi civilian, somewhere in her 40s, who had tried to tell his unit something about the building they were clearing, who had gestured and spoken words he could not parse in time, and who had been heard when the structure came apart in a way that his unit's assessment had not predicted, but that she had clearly known was coming. He did not know her name. He had never learned it. He had been spending 20 years since then being careful with people who were trying to tell him something, because he knew with precision what it cost when you didn't listen. His closest friend in the Gulf had been a man named Sergeant Theo Rains, from Harlan County, 40 miles south of Hazard. Same ridges, same creek hollows, same hill country that produced men who could fix anything and ask for help from nobody. Theo had done a second tour in Iraq in 2004 and died in Fallujah. The tour Marcus had already come home from, and Marcus had found out by a phone call that came on a Tuesday afternoon while he was eating lunch in his own kitchen. And the ordinariness of that, Tuesday, lunch, his own kitchen, had never quite left him. Theo had had a grandmother in Harlan who had never recovered from it. Marcus had never found out what happened to her. He drove the back roads of eastern Kentucky now. On every county route his job took him down, with the specific attentiveness of a man who has decided that the grandmothers do not get left behind again. Pepper was a blue-tick conehound mix, 58 pounds, with one blue eye and one brown, and a nose that Marcus had come to regard with the respect normally reserved for instruments of precision. He had found her in a culvert on a flood response call 3 years ago, half drowned, every rip visible, and had driven her to the vet and then to his house, and had not substantially reconsidered either decision. She was not a trained detection dog. She had a conehound's birthright relationship with ground scent, and she had a specific behavior learned in 3 years of going with Marcus to flood sites and collapse assessments, that had learned not to ignore. When she found something wrong beneath a floor, she lay down flat over the spot and would not move until he had looked at it. She had been right both times he had seen it. The Ridge House on the Hazard Road belonged to Opal Strunk. Marcus knew Opal the way county emergency services people know the elderly homeowners on their routes, by address, by note in the dispatch file, by the particular quality of the name that appears 3 or 4 times a year in the call logs, because a neighbor reported a light left on or a porch door standing open, or something that didn't look right. Anne knew she was 86 and had taught 5th grade at Hazard Elementary for 38 years, and that Thomas Strunk, her husband, had died 8 years back and was remembered at First Baptist with the specific fondness reserved for men who showed up when showing up was what was needed. It had driven past her ridge road 16 times in 3 years and stopped twice to check in. Both times, Opal Strunk had answered the door in the composed manner of a woman who had been running her own life since before Marcus was born, and who found the implication that she might need checking on to be both touching and unnecessary. Both times, she had told him she was fine and that everything was in order and that she appreciated him stopping. Both times, she had meant it. The third time he stopped, Pepper had already told him it wasn't going to be that kind of visit. Opal Strunk opened the door before Marcus had his hand up to knock, which told him she had heard the truck, and which told him something else. That a woman who opened doors before they were knocked on was a woman who had been paying attention to the road. She was wearing a housecoat and slippers. Her white hair, pinned up the way had probably been pinned up every morning for 60 years. And she held the door with both hands in the posture of someone who had made peace with needing the door for balance, but was not going to announce it. Marcus Dean, she said. You're out early for county business. Morning, Miss Opal. He looked at Pepper, who was already at his side with her nose at the threshold. I was coming up the ridge road and wanted to check in ahead of the rain. Weather Service has a flood watch posted starting tomorrow night. Opal looked at the sky, which was the flat gray of a day building towards something. I've been here through 47 flood seasons, she said. Thomas and I never had water come over the foundation once. Yes, ma'am. He waited. Mind if we come in for a minute? I like to just walk the perimeter on the properties up here before a flood watch. Make sure everything's buttoned up. She looked at him with the dark, specific eyes of a woman who taught 5th grade for 38 years and could identify a student who had not done the reading from 20 feet away. Then she looked at Pepper. That hound going to track mud. She'll stay on the mat, Marcus said. Pepper walked directly past the mat into the kitchen. She stopped in the center of the kitchen floor, 4 feet from the refrigerator, and lay down flat. She put her chin on the linoleum and did not move. Marcus looked at the dog. He looked at the kitchen floor. He looked at the refrigerator, which had been pulled 6 inches from the wall on the left side, a detail that struck him as odd because the appliance was heavy and old and there was no obvious reason for the gap. Behind the refrigerator, where the baseboard met the floor, there was a thin line, the seam of a crawlspace access panel, cut into the floor. The kind of hatch that older Kentucky Ridge houses had for accessing the foundation plumbing. The panel had been covered with a piece of plywood, cut to fit and painted the same color as the floor. The paint was not old. Miss Opal, Marcus said. Has anyone done foundation work on this house recently? Something moved in Opal Strunk's face, not concealment. Something more like the careful arrangement of a woman deciding how much of a thing to say. Dwayne Collett, she said. He's a contractor. He came out about a year and a half ago and said there was a crack in the foundation that needed addressing. He's been working on it. As he finished, a pause. The length of the pause told Marcus everything the pause was trying not to say. He said, the main work was done, she said, last spring. Marcus crouched beside the crawlspace panel. He pressed his fingers to the edge of the plywood. It moved, not fixed. Set. He looked up at Pepper, who had not moved, whose chin was on the floor, whose one blue eye and one brown eye were watching him with the flat patience of a nose that had already told him everything it knew. He lifted the panel. The smell came first. Cold, mineral, the particular rot of wood that has been wet for a long time in the dark. He took out his work light and shone it into the crawl space below. The floor she stood on every morning to make her coffee was 3 inches from giving way. The main joist nearest the original foundation crack had been eaten through by water damage and mold over 14 months of standing moisture. The crack in the port foundation, which should have been filled and sealed, had not been touched. A length of plastic sheeting had been laid loosely over part of the crawlspace floor, not secured, not properly installed. The kind of thing put down to look like work had been done for a person who was not going to look closely. The mold on the joists nearest the waterline was black and dense. The separation at the compromised joist was visible from below. 3 inches of gap, the wood soft at the edges. The floor above it held in place by proximity to its neighbors, but not by its own integrity. Marcus sat back on his heels. He did not look at Opal yet. He kept his voice exactly the same as it had been since he walked in. "Miss Opal," he said, "how much has Dwayne Collett charged you for this work?" The silence that followed was not a long one, but it had weight. $14,000, she said, in several payments. Marcus nodded slowly. He looked at the crawl space. He looked at the plastic sheeting. He looked at the mold. "Did he give you receipts?" "He wrote them on a pad," she said. "He said they were binding." He stood up. He turned to face her, and he kept his expression from doing what it wanted to do, because Opal Strunk did not need his reaction. She needed his attention. "You haven't told your daughters," he said. It was not a question. She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I didn't want them to think I couldn't manage," she said. Her voice was steady and specific, the voice of a woman who has been managing things her entire life and is not prepared to accept the implication that this one thing means otherwise. "You managed it exactly right," Marcus said. "You let a contractor in. You paid him. You trusted the receipts. That's what a person is supposed to do." He paused. "What he did with what you gave him, that's not on you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached for the counter beside the stove and held it. And Marcus looked away because some things deserve privacy. "Do you know someone like Opal? Someone who paid a person they trusted and got nothing in return, and couldn't tell anyone because the shame of being taken sat heavier than the loss? If that person came to mind just now, call them this week. They deserve to be remembered." Marcus made 4 calls from the kitchen. With Opal's permission, and with Pepper still lying on the floor over the crawl space, because that was where she intended to stay until the problem beneath it was addressed. The first call was to the Knott County Sheriff's Office, where a deputy named Carl Weston picked up, and Marcus told him what he had found and said he needed someone with the authority to compel contractor records. Carl said he'd be there. The second call was to the county building inspector, a woman named Brenda, who had been doing structural assessments in eastern Kentucky for 18 years, and who, when Marcus described the joist condition and the crawl space, said, "That floor needs to be vacated. Nobody stands on it until it's shored." She said she would come herself, today. The third call was to a structural remediation contractor Marcus trusted, a man named Pete Sizemore from Whitesburg, who had done flood repair work with Marcus for 6 years and who said, "Get me in there before that rain heats Thursday." Marcus said he would. The fourth call was the one he made standing on Opal's porch, low enough that she couldn't hear from the kitchen. He called Opal's daughter, Ellen, in Lexington, and said, "Your mother is all right. I need you to know that first. And I need you to know something else." Ellen arrived by 4 o'clock. Dwayne Collett was not hard to find. He was at a property 3 miles down the Ridge Road when Carl Weston and a second deputy located him at 2 in the afternoon. And when Carl told him where they were going, Dwayne came along in the particular manner of a man who has 3 or 4 versions of events already prepared and is deciding which one the situation calls for. He walked into Opal Strunk's front room at 2:30. He found Opal in her chair by the window, straight-backed, her hands in her lap, her reading glasses on. She had been reading when they came in, which was the detail Marcus noticed, because it meant she had decided to be exactly herself and not a woman bracing for something. He found Marcus Dean standing near the kitchen doorway. He found Deputy Carl Weston by the front door. He found Brenda, the building inspector, at the kitchen table with her documentation folder open. He found Ellen, Opal's daughter, on the couch with the expression of a woman who had driven 2 hours and had not had time to decide whether what she felt was grief or fury, and had landed somewhere between them that was very quiet. And he found Reverend Clay, who had come in 15 minutes earlier on his monthly visit, who had set his coat on the rack by the door and taken a chair at the end of the room, and who looked at Dwayne Collett the way a man looks at someone he is going to pray for later, in a way that is not entirely charitable. Pepper had moved from the kitchen to the space between Opal's chair and the center of the room. She was not lying flat now. She was sitting, her weight forward, her head level, watching Dwayne with the still undivided attention of a nose that had already delivered its verdict. Dwayne looked at the room, He did the recalculation. Marcus saw it, the specific speed of a man counting exits. Ane put on the version of himself that had worked 14 times in 14 months. Reasonable, regretful, already explaining. Miss Opal, he said, I don't know what you've been told, but there were complications with the remediation that I was going to address. Pepper's growl was low and continuous, not loud, the kind of sound that has no alarm in it, because alarm implies uncertainty. This was not uncertain. Dwayne looked at the dog. He took one step toward Opal's chair. Pepper stood up. She did not move from her position between Opal and Dwayne. She stood in it, all 58 pounds of her, and the growl held its register. And Dwayne went still. A sighed it was done. 5 words. Opal sighed them without heat, without accusation, without the trembling that people might expect from an 86-year-old woman saying something that has been sitting in her chest for a year. She sighed them the way she had said things to 5th graders for 38 years, plainly with the full weight of their meaning, without decoration. It took my money, she said. He told me the foundation was repaired. It told me the floor was sound. She looked at Dwayne Collette without flinching. I stood on that floor every morning for 14 months, because he told me it was safe. Ellen looked at her hands. Reverend Clay looked at Dwayne. Brenda opened her documentation folder and set a photograph on the table. The crawl space, the compromised joist, the 3-inch gap. She did not explain it. The photograph explained itself. Marcus sighed. Brenda has documented the crawl space condition. The remediation work Dwayne billed $14,000 for was not performed. The foundation crack is unchanged from the condition it would have been in when the contract was signed. The plastic sheeting in the crawl space is not an installation. It's a prop. He kept his voice at its working register, the same one he used in flood zones and collapse assessments, even and specific. Carl has the contract documents. The Knott County Attorney's Office will be reviewing the contractor records against 3 other elderly homeowners in this county who paid Dwayne Collette for work in the last 2 years. Dwayne looked at Carl. Carl looked back at him with the patient expression of a deputy who has made an arrest before and is not in any hurry about this particular one. Dwayne's hands, at his sides, went still. He looked at Opal. There was something moving in his face. Not remorse. Not yet, but the beginning of the thing that comes before it in a man who has been certain he was untouchable. The specific moment of understanding that the math has changed. Pepper watched Dwayne Collette leave the room. She held her position until the door closed and his truck was gone from the drive. Then she turned. She walked to Opal's chair and lay down across her feet, fully and without asking. And Opal looked down at her with an expression Marcus would not describe to anyone, but would not forget. Ellen crossed the room to her mother's chair, and Opal reached up and took her daughter's hand, and they sat that way for a moment without speaking, which was the right thing and the only thing. Dwayne Collette was charged with contractor fraud, elder financial exploitation, and criminal endangerment across 4 separate complaints filed by the Knott County Attorney's Office. The other 3 homeowners on his county route, Once contacted, had stories similar to Opal's, each of them embarrassed, each of them reluctant until they understood they were not alone. Pete Sizemore shored the compromised joists and sealed the foundation crack in 2 days' work, finishing 12 hours before the flood watch came through on Thursday evening. The troublesome creek ran high for 2 days and receded. Opal's floor held. Ellen stayed through the weekend and the weekend after that, and in December she brought her family down from Lexington for the first time in 3 years. The house on the ridge smelled like biscuits and wood smoke. Aunt Pepper slept on the kitchen floor over the sealed crawl space hatch, in the particular way of a dog who has decided that a piece of ground is hers to watch, and nobody argued with her. The congregation at First Baptist organized a check-in rotation for Opal that winter, not because she needed supervision, which she did not, but because she had taught half the county's grandparents when they were 9 years old, and they had been meaning to say thank you for decades. And this seemed like the right time. Former students came by on Saturdays. The parlor got noisy on Sunday afternoons, in a way it hadn't been since Thomas was alive. Marcus drove back up the Ridge Road twice a week through November. He was not always invited in because Opal was not a woman who needed company every time a truck came up her road. Bure came anyway because the road was on his route, and because Theo Raines' grandmother in Harlan had not had anyone on her road. And because some debts do not get paid to the person you owe them to, they get paid forward. There are people in this world who spend their whole lives giving things away. Not just money, not just time, but the specific, irreplaceable things. 38 years of attention to children who needed to be seen, the patience to wait for a student to find the right word, the particular quality of being believed in by someone who had no obligation to believe in you. They gave it without accounting. They never asks for a ledger. And then someone comes along who knows exactly what that generosity costs and turns it against them. A coonhound, with mismatched eyes, lay down flat on a kitchen floor. That was all it took. This story is for every person who trusted someone and was taken advantage of, and who carried the shame of it alone when the shame was never theirs to carry. And for every former student who has been meaning to go back and say thank you. Is there an opal in your life? A teacher, a neighbor, a person who shaped you when you were young and whom you haven't checked on in too long? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one, and this section fills up with names of people who deserve to be remembered. Every story on this channel is about not walking past the door. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.